So tonight I have with me on the Reformation Charlotte podcast, Rod Martin. He is an officer of the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee. Rod, aren't you, tell us a little bit about your background. Weren't you involved in the startup of PayPal and something with Apple or whatever? If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your background and then how you became involved with the Executive Committee and what you're doing with that now.
Sure. I was one of the early guys at PayPal. I've been policy director for Governor Mike Huckabee, been involved in a bunch of biotech and other internet things, and some of those are at interesting stages right now. I'm a lifelong Southern Baptist, certainly a Baptist long before I was a Christian, as I think most Baptists probably are, and I got saved in a Southern Baptist church, and actually went to my very first Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting with Judge Paul Pressler, and have been going ever since. That would have been, I guess, 1990, and it was a fascinating experience. That was right at the end of the conservative resurgence. We're finally able to straighten out our seminaries and our missions boards, and it shouldn't surprise us that that's a more than once a century kind of event. We've all read the book of Judges. We know that these things cycle through, and it's worthwhile. It's very important. I obviously don't do this for a living. I'm not a pastor, but the fact of the matter is we have 6 Southern Baptist seminaries that educate a third of the seminary students on the continent. We only have 11% of America's churches, but we're educating a third of the seminary students. This is a much, much bigger deal than just us. And likewise, we have the biggest missionary force in evangelical Christendom anywhere in the world. So these things really matter. They affect a shocking number of people, and they're worth fighting for.
You seem to be very committed and very loyal to the Southern Baptist Convention, and that's probably, to be completely honest with you, you're a lot more committed to it than I am.
Well, I'm not sure I can blame you today, but nevertheless.
Well, I am a Southern Baptist, and I'm a Southern Baptist because my church is a Southern Baptist church. With all of the stuff going on in this woke movement, it almost seems to regular lay people that it hasn't gotten any better. It continues to get worse, and it looks like it's just going to keep getting worse. So what do you see as far as the future of the Southern Baptist Convention? I don't know if you saw the podcast with John Harris and Dr. Russell Fuller, who used to be the professor at Southern Seminary recently.
I know them both, but I haven't seen that podcast yet.
Well, he predicted that this investigation that we're going to get into here in just a minute, with the Executive Committee, he predicted that this is going to be probably the end of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, that's his prediction. I don't know. But from the legal ramifications of everything that's happened with this investigation, and you'll tell us a little bit more about that, I'm assuming, do you really see a bright future for the Southern Baptist Convention? Do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're going to have to fight for it, and it's not going to be easy. Russ isn't wrong that this could be a death blow. That what has been done here is exceedingly needless and foolish, not to have an investigation, but to do it in the way that the Executive Committee voted to do it, which was, again, needless and foolish. And we'll come back to that in a minute. As far as seminaries and certain megachurch pastors and so forth becoming woke, I don't think we should be overly shocked by that. What is shocking is that the conservative resurgence worked. We're the only denomination of which I'm aware anywhere in the world that has been taken over by liberals and come back from that. And that is the function of our unique church polity, not 100% unique, but certainly unique among the major, larger denominations. We actually are congregational. And the denominational structure isn't strictly speaking a denomination at all. It has no authority over the local church. What it has is a stewardship mission to shepherd the dollars that individual tithers give through their churches to support things like seminary education, sending of missionaries, and so forth, feeding of widows and orphans, all the different things we do. None of our boards are, strictly speaking, ecclesiastical in nature. They're all trustee boards for the purpose of being entrusted with those tithe dollars. And that's a very different thing. And it produces a very different outcome if the people will just work the system. That outcome is that, unlike a system such as the Catholics have, where you have a pope and he's chosen by a bunch of people that you have no say over whatsoever, and bishops, and you have no say over them either, and so on and so forth, or even a system like the Presbyterian Church 100 years ago, when the liberals defrocked Machen and took everything over there. You don't have a top level that is impenetrable once it's in somebody's hands. The people who turn out every year at the annual meeting have the ability to completely upend the system, not instantaneously, but over just a few years. We saw that in the 80s. It's doable today. And I guarantee you, the overwhelming majority of the Baptist in the pew is not woke. And you can see it by who they vote for in regular politics. They're overwhelmingly conservative. They just have to be roused out of their slumber and show up at the annual meeting. We had a good start on that this year. We doubled turnout at the annual meeting this year from 8,000 to 16,000. I think we can do better in 22.
Yeah, that's a good transition into what I want to get into tonight is how this investigation came about. It began really before the annual meeting with, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like it began when a letter was leaked by Russell Moore's staff to the Southern Baptist Convention about making, making some pretty serious allegations against, he didn't name any names, but I'm assuming the executive committee that would include you and others and Ronnie Floyd. Tell us a little bit about that letter and then how this investigation came about.
Well, that letter's fascinating because, as you just pointed out, it does not make any specific allegations whatsoever. That letter claims that the executive committee is engaging in and protecting a rape culture, shredding children and molesting them, all this stuff. I bet there hasn't been a child ever in the EC building. I would be shocked by that. The EC has about 30 staff members, and it does really, really sexy and fascinating things like counting money and sending it to the other entities to spend. I mean, this is not a mega church where you could have a youth minister go rogue. It's just not that kind of thing. It's about as likely to have that sort of thing going on as your local bank branch. It's just nonsensical. But if there's truth in it, of course, we ought to investigate that. So now I don't have any problem with investigating. I have a great deal of problem with allegations that, and you know that we now have a whistleblower letter from one of Russell Moore's trustees who tells us plainly, first of all, the letter purported to have been sent to Russell's entire board. That was a lie. It was actually sent just to a handful on his own, the executive committee for the ERLC, not the executive committee I serve on for the whole Southern Baptist Convention. A handful of those guys got it, primarily David Prince, who's the board chairman. They then sat on it. We're in the 20th month since these mandatory reporters haven't picked up the phone and called the police. If they know of sex abuse, they have a legal obligation to call 911, which they have not done, nor have they shared any names of supposed victims with us. We don't know who these people are, if any of them exist, and that's not an internal interdenominational matter. That is a criminal matter. You don't get to just hand this to a task force that you make up and have Ed Litton appoint. You actually have to call law enforcement. If anything, he should have called the FBI, the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General for the state of Tennessee. Nothing at all. So the fact is, Russell Moore is either a liar or a criminal. And it's really, really horrifying, because though an investigation is not a terrible idea if there are credible allegations, what they then structured was clearly designed by Russell and his friends to be a hit on all of his political enemies and on the Southern Baptist Convention as a whole.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you about next. This letter came out right before the annual meeting, and there was a very tight race between, well, really, there were three main contenders. There was one that didn't get a lot of votes. There was Al Mohler, who got third place, I guess. And didn't Mike Stone actually have more votes in the first round, or am I misunderstanding that? Than
Yes,
Ed Litton?
Mike Stone came first by a pretty wide margin on the first ballot, but it was less than 51%. On the second ballot, most of Al Mohler's votes went to Ed Litton, which honestly is a shame, since he had a whole bunch of scandals pop up immediately after that happened, including, as you know, turned out there was a Trinitarian heresy on his church's statement of faith. That got pointed out from the floor right after he was elected. A little late, guys, but still. And that got erased without comment or apology within 15 minutes of being pointed out. And then, of course, there's him team preaching with his wife. There's a bunch of video of that. He claims to be a complementarian and claims that that is complementarian. But there it is. She is on the platform with him. They're preaching together, and she is referring to sermons they have, quote, preached together. And then, just for funnies, a plagiarism scandal. Right. And, it's not one sermon. It's not just similar. It's many, many sermons for starters, and there's a lot of video, but among the things done, he actually takes other people's personal experiences and claims them as his own. Right. And I mean, come on, you can't be doing that stuff. If you were to do that at any of our seminaries, you'd be expelled immediately. And the fact that there are actually Southern Baptist leaders who have covered for this or even made excuses for it. Malcolm Yarnell, a preaching professor at Southwestern Seminary, referred to this, basically suggested that plagiarism is impossible. We're just doing, quote, theology in community. Mm-hmm. Well, that's funny. I don't think I'd have gotten away with that in grad school, or for that matter, third grade. And I don't think Malcolm would have either. And nobody believes we would have. So you had this nightmare that largely came, and I'll take some blame for that. We didn't vet Ed Litton. We didn't treat him like a political candidate in a Senate race or a presidential race. We've learned our lesson. Anybody who wants to run next time is going to get the full deal. We're going to know, what they wrote on their laundry list. That's going to happen. But anyway, yes, Stone came first on the first ballot. Most of Mohler's votes, or rather, I should say, a slim majority of Mohler's votes did go to Ed Litton on the second ballot. If we had flipped 300 out of 16,000, Stone would be president.
There was something that, if I understand correctly, there was something that transpired in between the first vote and the second vote. And I don't know all of the details about this, and maybe you do, and maybe you can clear this up for me. Was there an issue where one of the alleged abuse victims ran into Mike Stone somewhere in the hallway or something? And
actually, that was the night before. And she claims that he came up to her and accosted her, which sounds just like what a candidate for president wants to do the night before his election. I mean, this does not pass the smell test at all, even if I didn't know the man. But I do know the man. He's one of the nicest people I know. He's a fantastic pastor and preacher. And by the way, he is himself a sex abuse victim. I mean, to attack Mike Stone on this stuff is just absurd. It is ridiculous on its face, but also there are a bunch of actual eyewitnesses to what happened there. And they say consistently that she came up to him and accosted him. One person I know says that he saw, or that someone he knows saw, so this is hearsay, of course, but that an employee of one of the other presidential candidates pointed Stone out to her and sicked her on him. I don't know if that's true, but
I heard that
I don't
too.
know, you might. But regardless, he did not assault a sex abuse victim the night before he had an election to win. That's idiotic. But yes, that got a lot of play at the time in typical dirty tricks fashion.
So when I looked at this entire, I'm going to call it a scandal because it sounds like a scandal to me, as far as the election went, and Russell Moore dropping that letter. And to me, I even put out an article entitled "Chicago Politics in the SBC." That's what it sounds like. It sounds.
I agree. And by the way, that's pretty much what Jonathan Whitehead, the Harvard attorney on the ERLC trustee board, said in his whistleblower letter last month. He said this was, and he provided all kinds of supporting material, emails from the chairman of their board of trustees, and all these different things. And he says in his letter that it was a blatant deception for the purpose of swinging the election.
I was blown away when I read that letter from Whitehead, and I mean, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, how what is Russell Moore's motivation, do you think, for this? Is this retaliation for the executive committee launching an investigation into him in the ERLC a couple of years back, do you think, or is there more to it than that?
I think that's absolutely part of it. He had it in for Stone. Ronnie Floyd was the one behind that investigation, but Stone was chairman of the executive committee at the time that vote took place, and he was named chairman of that investigative task force. Note that they weren't investigating Russell for unnamed sex abuse things. They were investigating the ERLC's operations vis-a-vis Southern Baptist churches who are demonstrably withholding cooperative program giving because of left-wing political stands the ERLC has taken. It should not be lost on anybody that Russell is a lifelong Democrat and used to be a staffer for a Democrat U.S. senator. So his politics are not those of the overwhelming majority of the Southern Baptist Convention, and he's definitely marching to a different drummer.
All right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I've been covering Russell Moore and his shenanigans for many years, and when he was first elected, or not elected, I guess, hired to the ERLC position back in 2013, I didn't know who he was other than that he was a professor or dean at SBTS. I wasn't really deep into the conspiracies of the Southern Baptist Convention at the time.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I thought it was a great hire. I didn't know Russell well at the time. I knew him just a little bit. If you hear him in the pulpit, the guy can preach. I mean, you'll come away with good stuff 95% of the time. And he's very charismatic. He's very capable, clearly gifted. And then he got in the ERLC job and immediately did this hard left turn. And it's just like, what are you doing? And don't misunderstand me. I am not asking every Southern Baptist to agree with me on all of these topics. That's not really the point. The point is that if you're the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, you are not allowed to freelance. You're not allowed to go do things really that the messengers haven't spoken to. His predecessor, Richard Land, who, was somewhat controversial too, always had a policy that the ERLC under his leadership would never speak to any issue on which the annual meeting had not passed a resolution. And the ERLC would never speak to that issue except in the manner directed by the messengers in said resolution. When Russell came in, he started just running his own show without reference to the rest of us. And it was, he took on, I believe the way he phrased it was, we have to speak with a prophetic voice to Southern Baptists. Well, that's not actually your ministry assignment.
Right.
Your ministry assignment is to speak for Southern Baptists as they have directed you to speak. And it was very disheartening, confusing to a lot of people, and it has caused unending division.
Well, the first red flag for me was there was a guy named Ken Fryer back then who I was a friend with.
Yeah.
And he found out that Russell Moore was a Democrat staffer. So that was the first red flag for me, to find out that Russell Moore was a Democrat. And then shortly after he took office, I think it started with the Michael Brown stuff. He immediately just launched this campaign against racism. But the racism, the way he defined racism was completely contrary to anything most people had ever heard. All of a sudden,
yes,
racism became systemic racism and not individual acts of racism against people. And then it became this huge thing with racial reconciliation. And he started traveling around and preaching against Confederate flags on buildings in the South, and it just all kinds of stuff. And it got really bizarre really quick. And I'm not necessarily saying that, we should support Confederate flags on government buildings, but when did it become the function of the church to go out there and to start campaigning against all of these cultural issues? And then the issue was clearly so divided between all of Southern Baptists. And like you said, he just started doing his own thing here. He had a lot of support with this at first, but then over the years, his support waned really quickly. So it kind of seems like, as he came in and did his damage, if you will, in the Southern Baptist Convention, he's kind of left this legacy behind. And it almost seems like the damage is done and it's going to be too hard to fix now. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's a lot of damage. And look, I'm a Southerner. You can listen to me and hear that, but
right, me too.
I'm also a Republican. I'm against Democrat presidents like Joe Biden and Jefferson Davis. That's just not really my thing. But at the same time, there you go. At the same time, what Russell was attacking, and you see this in a decent number of megachurch pastors now, you guys do a good job of pointing out some of these things, and others also. It's not racism as we've ever known it, which is the idea that someone would do something against someone else based on their skin color. And by the way, that is what 75% of Americans of almost all races agree is the definition of racism. And that includes African Americans. African Americans, by 3/4, agree that the definition of racism you and I grew up with is the correct definition of racism. So we're talking about a definition that is only held to by a very small minority of Americans. And that's the critical theory based definition. In this case, specifically critical race theory, but as you know, there are a bunch of subsets of critical theory, including radical feminism and queer theory and right, all the rest. So from a critical theory standpoint, you say, well, if there is a disparate outcome, that must be racism or must be sexism or whatever. So in a non-racial context, we might say, well, if a woman enters a profession and then decides subsequently to take 20 years off to raise children and then comes back to her profession, it is sexism if she does not re-enter her profession at the level she would have been at if she had been in it those 20 years. Well, that's just nonsense. That's just silly. That's not about sexism. That's about you took 20 years off. And so it's the same kind of shell game when we talk about critical race theory. You have a disparate outcome standard, which also includes a definitional standard. And I hardly have to tell you, you can read Ember and Kendi and, all of these guys. They're very, very clear that you cannot be racist if you are a group that is part of a majority,
right,
which is broadly speaking in power. So for instance, just to simplify it, white males, no matter what their status in life, doesn't matter if they're Joe Biden or a bum living in an alley, they are in power and they are definitionally privileged. And if you are Barack Obama, it doesn't matter that you're president, you are oppressed by that bum in the alley. And so again, it is nonsensical. It's the kind of foolishness that only a bunch of people with PhDs could ever dream up in the first place. And it has a very specific motivation. This is coming to you straight from a line going back to Gramsci in Italy, Marcuse, all of these guys who realized that communism didn't sell in the West. It just didn't, because everybody in America especially thinks that they will be better off tomorrow than they are today, and their kids will be better off than they are. So class warfare didn't sell. And what critical theory really does is it substitutes in words like privileged in place of bourgeoisie and oppressed in place of proletariat. And it changes the labels so that it sells better to a bunch of 21-year-old gender studies majors, but it's still selling the exact same class warfare for the same purpose, the amassing of power in an elite group and the marginalization of all of the enemies of the elite group. It is redistribution both of power and of wealth for the same purpose and to the same end. It's just a little more marketable. So do every single group of people who subscribe increasingly to this rhetoric understand half of what I just said? No, not suggesting that at all. A lot of the people who were advocating class warfare didn't understand the ramifications of supporting liberation theology either, but the result is the same.
Wow. You're a wealth of information on this, and I could pick your brain all night long.
Well, thank you, because of course on Twitter, I am said to know nothing about critical race theory. Obviously,
well, of course.
Like everybody who opposes it, we just don't understand. We haven't read.
Let me guess, Bradley Mason.
Of course, yeah. and Kyle and the
Kyle.
whole group.
Oh yeah. But yeah, those guys all blocked me a long time ago, I think. So steering back to the investigation, I think we've established pretty succinctly that Russell Moore is doing this out of retaliation. Okay, so the messengers actually voted for Ed Litton.
They did.
To carry out this investigation, and during that vote, I think there's a debate here. Did they actually vote for the executive committee to waive attorney-client privilege, or was that a suggestion as a result of the vote?
Well, let me say first, I don't blame them one bit for calling for the investigation. If you have that kind of charge from a person they have trusted that long, of course you ought to look into it. I totally support that. In every one of our debates at the executive committee, I said, and I think every member of the executive committee said in one way or another, at one point or another, we don't have a problem with the investigation at all. We're for that. We need to clear the air. If there are victims of anybody at the EC, we need to know it. We need to string them up by their toenails. If there aren't, we need to clear the air, and we need to show that a bunch of people who have been accused were accused falsely. Either way, the investigation is fine. Grant Gaines and Ronnie Parrott did write, by the way, I'm sure Rachel Denhollander actually wrote, but they wrote into their motion this waiver of attorney-client privilege and it was listed as one of several otherwise unnamed best practices for this kind of investigation. Well, we have 4 lawyers on the executive committee, including an officer of the EC who has actually led sex abuse investigations for the Department of Justice of the United States of America. We have 5 external lawyers, or at least we did at the time of the debate, because now 2 of them have withdrawn. But 5 lawyers, one of whom was a U.S. attorney and one of whom was a nominee for Supreme Court of the United States. And every single one of those people told us, not only is this not a best practice or a standard practice, it's actually malpractice. No lawyer could possibly advise their client to do this under any circumstances. And there are all the reasons we could talk about, and I think you've done a really good job of explaining that to people. But the one that everybody's missing is the one that I kept coming back to in our discussions at the EC. And it's this: if you waive privilege in this way, you void your insurance. Now, we have not yet been notified that the insurance is going to ditch us, but that's for sure coming, just as some of our lawyers leaving and some of our members resigning were for sure coming. And now those things have happened. It may take another week, it may take another 3. But when we lose the insurance, I kept asking people, if there are victims here, how do you expect to pay them? Oh, we'll spend any amount. You don't have any amount. The EC only has X amount of cash reserves, and for this kind of claim, it ain't that much. And it has yay amount of budget. Well, we're over budget already. We've got 3 employees at the executive committee who are being paid for by the North American Mission Board because Ronnie Floyd doesn't have enough budget to pay all of his staff. Now, that's a whole nother issue we should talk about another time. But the point is, they can't cut budget without firing people. And they've already dipped into cash reserves because we fully funded the investigation at the top estimate Guidepost Solutions gave us, which was $1.6 million. And yeah, you could do that another time or 2 or 3, but you can't do it infinitely. So then you get into the question of, well, where does that money come from? And look, if you remember the Hulk Hogan case, that Terry Bollea sues Gawker for $140 million. Well, he was right, and Gawker was guilty, and he won the judgment. Where's $140 million coming from? And if you don't have insurance, how are you even going to pay your legal bills to fight this in court? I mean, even if all you're doing is having a settlement negotiation because Guidepost finds unequivocal, clear evidence that, Sally Sue Smith was harmed, and we all want to make her whole. Okay, where's the money coming from if you blew the insurance? Then you get into other issues with that. But just focusing there, I told the group, this is the be warm and be filled motion. Because you're going to be sending victims away if there are victims as you think. You're going to be sending them away with nothing, because you don't have any money to pay them if you blow this. And that argument carried the day 2 meetings worth, but ultimately lost in the end.
A couple of years ago, there's a point to this, so hear me out for a second. A couple of years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention held the Caring Well Conference.
Yes.
And at that conference was Beth Moore,
yes,
Rachel Den Hollander, right? Mm. And others. And at that conference, Beth Moore said something along the lines of complementarianism or complementarian theology opens the door to sex abuse. Something, I'm paraphrasing there, but something along those lines that she said while she was preaching.
I remember it.
Yeah. So it almost sounds like there's a lot of people in the Southern Baptist Convention who have an issue with the complementarian theology. And if you don't know what that is, whoever's listening, complementarian theology is basically disallows women preachers and teaches that men and women have different roles in the church, whereas opposed to egalitarian theology, men and women have equal roles in the church, or the same roles in the church.
Even more precisely, it just says that men and women are different. and that God designed them differently, and they complement one another. Not they say each other's good looking, but I mean that this one is better with this one, and vice versa, and that God has designed them to have different roles, and you know, depending on who you talk to, that might mean something more restrictive or less. Now, I don't have a problem with a woman being, say, the president of my foundation. And in fact, I am on my second woman president of my foundation in a row. And, you know, I have no issue with that because the Bible doesn't say anything about charitable foundations. But in 1 Timothy 2, it says that it wouldn't let a woman teach a man in church. And in 1 Timothy 3, the qualifications for both elders and deacons very clearly restricts it to husbands of one wife. So that being the case, you know, if I were writing the Bible, I might not have written it that way. You know, I grew up in the 80s. So, you know, that kind of offends my way of thinking as an American in our time. But as a Christian, who am I to argue with God? I mean, so let's jump out of 1 Timothy and go back to Romans 9. Who is the clay to speak back to the potter? If he says, this is how I want it done, then this is how it has to be done. And Beth Moore is a very gifted and talented woman, but I don't think that she's as smart as God. And I don't think that she has his rights to define what offices he will allow for which people.
So my theory with this is, and maybe I'm wrong, but as you know, Beth Moore has pretty much departed the Southern Baptist Convention on account of
this
complementarian theology that she hates. It seems
I noticed that she left over her issues with complementarianism 5 years after she says she quit believing in it, and managed to take a lot of money home from her rich Lifeway contract during those intervening years.
Right. So she was pushing really hard for the Southern Baptist Convention to change this, and it didn't work while she was here, so she left. But it seems like her and Rachel Denhollander, and now Rachel Denhollander seems to be one of the people that are just really just pushing this investigation into the EC.
Yes,
she seems to be
the chief consultant to the task force.
She seems to be like the all right, and there's a conflict of interest in there somewhere. But do you think that? Oh
wait, I can identify a couple of them for you. She has been the attorney, to the best of my knowledge. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But to the best of my knowledge, she was the attorney for Jen Lyle, who sued the EC. By the way, not for sex abuse, for defamation, because a Baptist Press story was not written in the way that she thought it should be. And I'm not going to try to litigate that here. I'm just saying this is a party opponent in the area being investigated by the task force. And to the best of my understanding, Rachel was her lawyer. And then also, I was told, this was a private conversation, I can't prove this, but it is my understanding that Rachel further represented a different person who is suing the EC. Interestingly, again, for defamation, not for actual abuse. And all the more interesting because the EC hasn't spoken about her in any way, shape, or form. So, you know, these are odd cases in certain respects, but Rachel is a common thread, as best I can tell, in both of them. But she's the chief consultant to this task force. And yes, in a real legal proceeding, she would be hopelessly conflicted out, if I understand that correctly.
So she's an attorney, yet she's the one that wrote into this motion that the Southern Baptist Convention voted on about waiving attorney-client privilege.
I believe so, yes.
So it almost sounds like she did this by design. She knew. Yeah,
like she's setting up the class action suit she wants to file later. Yes.
Right. So I'm sure she knew that most of the people who were at that convention that voted really didn't understand the ramifications of what they were voting for there.
Not at all. And you've probably interviewed Tom Askell at some point. He had a motion. He was at the microphone for hours and hours. wanted to offer to overturn Resolution 9 from 2019, which is the critical race theory resolution. He couldn't get called on, but they had at least one attorney on the platform to give legal advice to try to block his effort. By the way, it's my opinion, for what it's worth, that legal advice would have been wrong and false, but okay, there was actually a legitimate debate on that point. They had a lawyer ready to go to attack Tom Askell. They did not have a lawyer there for the purpose of addressing something as monumentally consequential as what is a best practice and does it include waiver of attorney-client privilege. The financial ramifications of this alone to potential victims, to missionaries and seminaries and the entire system are overwhelming. No, the chair ran this through as blatantly as anything I've ever seen in my life, in politics, church, you name it.
So Rachel Den Hollander, it seems like she did this on purpose for the purpose of, did she do this to destroy the Southern Baptist Convention? And if so, what is her motivation for doing so? What is her beef with the executive committee and whatever else that may go down with this? Well, she obviously has a reason for doing this.
You're a Southern Baptist, so you will follow all of this. Not all of your viewers are. So I'm going to try to give you the dime store version of this.
Right. But that's what we need.
The SBC is not a hierarchy. Just as I said at the outset, it does not have authority over local churches at all. So what we can do is we can expel a church or disfellowship a church, I think is the terminology du jour, if they are found to have, covered up sex abuse in an unrepentant way or engaged in some blatantly racist act or, bad things, deviate from the Baptist faith and message beyond a reasonable point. We can kick them out. We can do that. Here's the thing. In 2019, as you know, we amended our Constitution for only the third time in a century to set up an enhanced credentials committee to look in exactly these kinds of things. I went on the executive committee right after that happened. In the time that committee has existed, we have had several churches refer to the executive committee for expulsion. We have, to the best of my knowledge, removed every single one of them unanimously without debate. So there's no question the EC has taken an extremely hard line on these things, but there are a bunch of things we can't do. We can't send an investigator to your church. We don't have subpoena power. We don't have any enforcement ability other than what I just said. So Rachel has argued rather vigorously for making us into a more hierarchical structure. One of the things you see in the motion is a line about investigating resistance to reform measures. Well, that's as Inquisition-ish, Salem witch trial-ish a thing as I've ever seen in my life. So if you in a meeting one time said, wait, we can't do such and such because that's against Baptist church polity, then you were obstructing, some kind of inquiry into sex abuse. It is utterly political. It is shameful the way Grant and Ronnie and no doubt Rachel wrote it, and it can't help but demonize their political opponents without having any hint of veracity in terms of finding people who actually did anything wrong. So there's that aspect of it. There's the demonize your political opponents aim. But from a lawyer perspective, this is about money. Now, and I can't say it plainer because the SBC is not a hierarchy.
Now you got my ears perked up.
Yeah, the SBC is not a hierarchy, which means if you sue the EC, the executive committee, you get at most what the executive committee has. If you sue Southern Seminary, you get at most what Southern Seminary has. What you don't get is the assets of the Florida Baptist Children's Homes. You don't get the house that some missionary lives in Bangladesh. You don't get the assets at some local church. Now, if they're able to put us in a position where a case can be made in court that, in fact, we're a hierarchy that threatens everything, right? Well, here's what they've done. And I only said this in executive session until they went and waived privilege, and now it's all open to the world, so I might as well say it here. If I'm the trial lawyer, and trial lawyers are not here to play fair, trial lawyers are here to win for their client. A trial lawyer looks at this and says, okay, how do I build the case that something that's been established for over a century to not be a hierarchy really is? Okay, I'll sue not just the executive committee, but all the individual members and all the individual staff members down to the janitor. You say, well, why would that help? Because we blew the insurance, right? Without the insurance, all those people are going to have to pay their own legal bills at some point. We've got bivocational pastors on that EC. We've got secretaries. I literally just mentioned the janitor. These people can't suffer a $150,000 legal bill, much less $1 million legal bill. Some of them couldn't afford $5,000. So at some point, they cry uncle, and the trial lawyer puts in front of them a settlement agreement, which serves as a sworn confession. And where they going to confess to? Whatever the trial lawyer wants them to confess to. It's all going to be lies, but it's going to be sworn under oath. And what it's going to say is hierarchy, connectionalism. And then trial lawyer takes 30 or 40 of those sworn confessions to an Obama judge and says, see, these Christians are all liars. You need to take these guys down, take care of my client, give them $1.9 billion like the Boy Scouts. And the Obama judge is going to say yes. And he's going to take it out of everybody he can get to. So that is the real danger. And that's the part some of these preachers aren't seeing. The preachers are seeing, oh, I'm going to get my political enemy. The lawyers are seeing, oh, I'm going to make a name for myself and I'm going to buy a private island. And the preachers don't think that way because honestly, we're all captives of our grad school educations. I went to law school, they went to seminary. The lawyers know how the lawyers are thinking. And the preachers, honestly, for the most part, didn't. And so we're in this bind. Can we get out of it? Possibly, but it's going to be difficult. And they've really put us in harm's way. And what is harm's way? I mean, it's the end of potentially, if things really went badly, the end of a seminary system that educates a third of the seminary students in America and the largest missionary force in the world, preaching the gospel on every continent except, I guess, Antarctica. And that matters. If we have sex abusers, of course that matters too. But you don't completely shut down the temple in Jerusalem because a high priest goes bad. You cleanse the temple, and they're trying to burn it all down.
I want to ask you about all these pastors that from all the state conventions that came together signing these letters urging you to waive the attorney-client privilege. But before I ask you that, I want to ask you about another scandal that's taking place in the Southern Baptist Convention right now with the North American Mission Board, and ask you if that has any relation to this at all. From my understanding, the North American Mission Board is in the middle of a Supreme Court case right now. And in that case, Russell Moore wrote a letter to the Supreme Court, I believe, or maybe you can correct me here, arguing that the Southern Baptist Convention is a hierarchical organization, knowing that that's false. So was that also related to this? Was that part, do you think that was part of the plan to try to convince the judge or whatever in this case that the Southern Baptist Convention was a hierarchical organization? Obviously, it looks like that measure failed, thankfully, but.
Well, very good catch. And it's far from over because, of course, that amicus brief that Russell swore to was filed with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Okay. It then went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in Will McCraney's favor against NAM. So it's back to the trial court where now the folks at NAM are going to have to be deposed. And I don't have any insight into where that process will go. And the legal issues there are a bit more complicated than the ones we're discussing with regard to the EC. So I would like to reserve an opinion in the amount of time we have on that. But I will say that the argument that NAM is making could be viewed as establishing that there's a hierarchy. Now,
Yeah.
I don't think that's exactly what they're arguing. And I understand why Will is arguing that that's what they're arguing. And you know, I love Will to death. And I'm not arguing with his legal argument. I'm saying that that entire case potentially opens the door anyway. It's a little more complicated than that, but it does. What Russell did was he swore to a friend of the court brief that did absolutely state that the Southern Baptist Convention is a hierarchy. And obviously the legal implication of that is that if you have a slip and fall at the North American Mission Board, you can take the money over at Guidestone that goes to widows and orphans. So I mean, that's just a nightmare position. Well, why the heck would he do that? Well, first, his story is that he received the brief 45 minutes before the filing deadline, and they knew that there was stuff in it that was wrong, but they had to get it turned in. Well, that's just transparently bogus. They didn't have to file that thing at all. No one had solicited it. They weren't a party to the case. They did not have to swear to things under oath that were false. By the way, we have a legal term for swearing to things that are false. You might be familiar with perjury. And, you know, Russell's much belated response when everybody realized what he'd done was, oh, well, we sent the Fifth Circuit a letter. Well, that doesn't do any good. You swore to the filing you filed. You didn't swear to the letter. It's not of the same weight. And also, oh, wait, did you mention the deadline? Because your letter showed up way after the deadline. So it doesn't matter. It's not part of the ongoing record in that case. So yeah, if Rachel Denhollander or somebody else wanted to come back and sue everybody for everything, of course they're going to use Russell's brief to try to help establish that, well, see, here was the chief ethicist of the SBC, and he says it's a hierarchy. He swore to it under oath. So in my view, I mean, I can't know the man's heart, but I can see what he did. You know, this is the man who platformed Rachel in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
She has proceeded to do all of these things that argue for that, to not that that is our legal situation, but that it ought to be our legal situation. He drops that late fall of last year, and then 6 months later leaks these letters that charge a bunch of people with things that are frankly absurd and would again require him to have failed to mandatorily report the acts he claims to know about. 20 months later, he still hasn't reported any of them. So do I think that he is a liar, or in the alternative, a criminal? Yes, one or the other. Absolutely.
So Russell Moore has not named any specific allegations. Has Rachel Denhollander named any specific allegations against, or specific allegations of sex abuse cover-up against the executive committee?
If she has, I don't know it. That doesn't mean she hasn't. I don't follow her on Twitter, and I don't know what all she might have said. But as I mentioned, to the best of my knowledge, she did represent Jen Lyle, and I think she represented Hannah Kate Williams at one point. And Jen's case, as I understand it, if I misstate this, I apologize. I think this is accurate. Jen alleges that she was abused by a specific professor at Southern Seminary starting when she was a student there, and that continued for a period of years even after she was at Southern, and that her departure from Lifeway, where she was a vice president when this all came out, was fraught with issues that I don't know if she or her attorney would agree, but it looked to me like if Jen's version of events was accurate, she'd have a case against Southern for sex abuse, and she'd have a case against Lifeway for possibly wrongful termination and for the workplace harassment, not sexual harassment there, but workplace harassment. And yet she didn't sue them. And I don't understand why not. I'm not clear on any of that, but she did sue Baptist Press for writing a story that she thought was insufficiently favorable to her. And you argue about whether it was or it wasn't. I'm not here to comment on that. That's not my point. And I like Jen Lyle, a very nice lady, and I have no issue with her personally. But I note that, as I understand it, Rachel was the lawyer there. And it is, frankly, odd to me that lawsuit was not filed against Southern and Lifeway. If I had been the lawyer, it certainly would have been. And likewise, the Hannah Kate Williams case, which I honestly just find unfathomable. So has Rachel been involved in accusations against the EC? Yes. Has she said anything beyond that? I don't know. And of course, I'm not privy to the discussions she's having with the task force.
Right. She didn't have to waive her attorney-client privilege.
No, she did not. And it's worth pointing out, the motion very plainly not only does not require the task force or any accusers to waive privilege, the accusers may never be known to the people they're accusing. They may never be cross-examined. We can't even know what they said about anybody. It's all secret. But attorney-client privilege, which isn't about hiding facts, it's not about hiding criminal activity. Attorney-client privilege doesn't protect any of that. What attorney-client privilege does is protect your ability to talk to your lawyer about trial strategy, who you want to call as a witness, who you don't, all the kinds of inside baseball things that you need privacy for. And that's how our legal system functions. We don't have a civil law system like they do in Europe, where the judge is the finder of fact. We have a system that is adversarial in nature. The two lawyers are not there to help the judge find the truth. The two lawyers are there to zealously advocate for their clients, and then the judge and the jury determine how to apply the law to those facts and what the facts are, and so on and so forth. So if you are completely shrouding one side in secrecy and leaving the other side completely unable even to speak to its lawyers meaningfully about, do we call that guy as a witness, or, just inside stuff that has nothing to do with the merits of the case, it's really inherently unjust. It is truly like the Salem witch trials in that regard. And it's just a horrifying thing. Let me say, despite all of that, I think nearly everybody on the executive committee was willing to waive privilege anyway, so long as it was done in a way that actually was consistent with some standard practice. And there were a couple of suggestions about that, a special master being appointed, or this model that the University of Michigan used in a similar situation. Those were actually suggested, as I understand it, by Guidepost Solutions. And I think nearly everybody at the executive committee was totally open to that, as long as the task force was. And you understand why, because we didn't want to blow the insurance and thus render ourselves far less capable of paying any potential victims. But in the end, the majority went the other way because the task force insisted. And the task force absolutely wants this kangaroo court situation. And I think I understand it, but charitably speaking, I can't fathom it.
It sounds like obviously it sounds like you don't know who the alleged victims are.
No one has ever named a one.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, we know of Hannah Kate, but it sounds like her accusation is against Southern Seminary.
Well, she sued the seminary and Lifeway and the EC and several specific individuals, including myself, for defamation, which I just find mind-numbing. I don't understand that. And secondly, for civil conspiracy to cover up her case. Well, I don't even know how I'd do that. She tweets 50 zillion times a day. I mean, how would you cover it up? And what could I possibly do to do so? And anyway, it's never come before the executive committee at all. So I don't understand that lawsuit other than it was headline grabbing. And it definitely got her a very favorable puff piece in a major publication.
It sounds like all of these pastors who voted here at the Southern Baptist Convention for this were just, I think we've already established that they really didn't understand the ramifications of this. I can say,
and I don't blame them for that, because
I was going to say,
but they should have been advised, and it was the president's duty to make sure that they were advised, as he was planning to do on a different issue with much, much lesser ramifications. But yes, you're right.
There's not, we don't, do we have any, like what? I mean, it just seems so outlandish to me that we don't know what any of these accusations are. We don't know how many people are out there that are making these accusations. Yet they've put the livelihoods of a lot of people. How many people are on the executive committee board?
86 at any given time. And of course, the task force is looking back all the way to 2000. So there's no telling how many people we're talking about, plus staff.
That's a lot of people that could potentially be individually sued.
Yes.
And they don't have representation, at least not through the executive committee or the Southern Baptist Convention. Could they still get their own representation?
They can, but at some point they're going to have to pay for it.
Right.
The
exactly.
EC indemnifies all of them, but only to the point that it can pay. And that's why you have insurance. So at some point, the more people you include, the sooner the EC runs out of money and just ceases operations.
I think I heard you, maybe, I guess, I think it was you talking about this with Tom Askell the other day. There's a lot of attorneys out there that are going to look at this as an opportunity to be seized.
Have you been harmed by the Southern Baptist Convention? Call us. Do we cheat them and how?
Yeah. You're going to see commercials on television and everything. I mean,
yeah.
Have you or a loved one,
Well, and note, you don't even need a good plaintiff. I mean,
right.
There is, of course,
because attorneys are going to make money just by filing a lawsuit.
Filing a lawsuit is remunerative, but on top of that, if your real aim is to create a class action that results in a settlement, such as what happened with the Boy Scouts, and let's distinguish that the Boy Scouts actually were guilty. Mm-hmm. They brought in a bunch of gay scoutmasters and then a bunch of gay scouts, and then they started having girls in scouts, and you're going to put a bunch of teenagers in tents together, and at Jamboree they were handing out condoms by the tens of thousands, and you don't think something terrible is going to happen?
Where has this world gone?
They set up their own ticking time bomb. Of course they had issues, but if you want to turn the SBC into that, the SBC doesn't have to be guilty. Again, you just have to push them until they cry uncle and then sign a settlement. And that is what happened at the Boy Scouts. Those cases weren't tried on the merits. They settled because it was just getting out of hand.
It looks like that this is set up to happen. I mean, it looks like it's inevitable.
I think it is set up to happen. I'm not 100% certain that it has to be inevitable, but it's going to take a lot of smart, dedicated people to head off the worst. And I'm committed to be one of those. And I may personally have to resign from the executive committee, sadly and ironically, like some of the others. I'm on a bunch of other boards, and they may not allow me to serve on the executive committee while continuing on those boards, both for-profit and nonprofit. And so I have a decision coming up for me too, but I'm not abandoning the Southern Baptist Convention either way. This is the time, as it is said, for all good men to come to the aid of their country, or in this case, their church. And this is a concerted attack on the existence of the largest trainer of seminary students and the largest sender of missionaries. That has to be fought. Not fight the investigation. Fight all of the wickedness that will come in its wake. You
Mhm.
say, well, you're not concerned about the wickedness done to the sex abuse victims. How many times can I say that I support the investigation? I find the way we did it needlessly foolish. And we can still navigate that in a way that doesn't have to end in a shipwreck, but we're going to have to work very hard to make sure that that happens. And part of that, honestly, is the same thing that was true in Nashville. If we'd had 300 more people show up, Mike Stone would be president, and you'd have an investigation, and it would be a high quality investigation, and it'd be being conducted by Guidepost Solutions exactly the same, but it wouldn't have done something legally stupid. And
Right.
that shows you how important leadership truly is. We have to have leadership that is more concerned about the body of Christ and less concerned about appearing woke and virtue signaling to the crowd.
The executive committee held off for a long time for, voting against the attorney-client privilege.
Well, let me just say to that, the task force spent a lot of time rhetorically saying we had 100 days to consider this. That wasn't true. They signed the contract with Guidepost Solutions 2 weeks before our EC meeting. So we had 2 weeks to review it. We had no legal counsel on that at all until the first day of our in-person meeting. And then after that, you're correct that we did hold off on the fullness of what they were asking for, looking for a negotiated solution with the task force on how to do this in a way that would cause less harm, both to victims and of course to the SBC. And so that went on for another couple weeks. But it is not, as some of our opponents have suggested, that we were stonewalling since June. That's simply false.
So there was, if I understand right, you did not vote for waiving attorney-client privilege, but several others at some point during this process changed their mind. What was it that was kind of the turning point that caused them to stop digging their heels in? And
honestly, this is a good object lesson with regard to Anaheim, because where we lost the vote was when a bunch of people quit.
Okay.
We had several members resign, and they were all, well, nearly all of them were professionals. They're people who knew that their firms would force them to resign from the executive committee if the executive committee took this action. Accountants, lawyers, but we lost about 6 to 8 votes between week 2 and week 3. And if they had still been there, this vote would have gone the other way. And you say, well, but I thought the final vote was 2-1. It was, but the procedural vote immediately preceding it was 51-49. That was the first vote we lost. And you know what happens after that? Everybody follows. Everybody caves. So it probably would have gone 2-1 the other way if that vote had been 49-51. And so, yeah, those 6 or 8 people made the difference. I don't blame them for resigning. It's just that is the big thing that changed.
You've said that the executive committee is a fiduciary. Explain what that means in layman's terms, and what legal ramifications of this vote is.
At its simplest, it means that we are entrusted with the legal duty to steward the money. And you say, well, okay, so you're putting money before people. We kept getting told that. No, we are trying to fulfill the job the messengers gave us while also not breaking the law.
Right.
So if you have an accountant, for instance, they can't go sharing your tax returns. They can't go sharing your bank statements. And they have to give you advice and take actions that are in your interests. They can't pursue their own interests or somebody else's interests. And the law defines those interests pretty clearly. So in our situation, it's a little bit more complicated than just your accountant. We are the fiduciaries for the convention. We are responsible for making sure that action isn't taken that would cause harm, and in some cases like this one, potentially irreparable harm to the interests of the convention as a whole. and all those other entities. So some of those duties are really very simple, and they're not very hard to understand. Losing your insurance through something that you could have avoided when all of your lawyers told you you must not do, and legally, you have the power to do it, but not the right to do it. That is a blatant breach of fiduciary duty. And all I can say to that is that it's a very good thing we had a roll call vote. The other side wanted a roll call vote to put on the record all the people who weren't voting their way. What they didn't understand, obviously, is that we wanted that more than they did, because when people get sued for breach of fiduciary duty, it will be them. And that is a very real problem that they're likely to face in the near future. That's not a threat. That's not, scaremongering. It's done. It's completely over. And I didn't say that during the debate because it would have been taken poorly, but that's the reality. The people who voted that way are on a legal hook they can't get off of, and it's not with messengers, it's with the state of Tennessee.
Wow, you have given me a lot of information tonight, and I've kept you for a lot longer than I said I would. But
happy to do it, and I appreciate you guys. You guys took up for me the other day, so you're really high on my list.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Karen Swallow Pryor, she is a professor now at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary under Danny Aiken. She used to be a Liberty University professor.
And Liberty is much better for her departure. Yes.
She leveled a pretty serious accusation against you. What do you say about that? I mean,
what she said was per se defamation. And that is not a good thing to be doing for her financial future or for Southeastern seminaries. So when I get out from under a few of the other things that I am busy with right now, I'm sure they will be hearing from my lawyers, because you just can't do that stuff.
Yeah.
And these guys are very, very busily enacting or acting out their critical theory based definitions of a lot of things where the law defines those things very differently. And I'm sorry, what she did was horribly wrong. And we're gonna find out just how wrong in good time.
Well, that's good to hear. And
yeah, enough's enough.
Not because, I mean, she's been off my radar for a long time. She came on our radar several years ago when she was a research fellow at the ERLC, and she was pushing a bunch of stuff with the homosexuals and the film festivals, and then it's like after that she all of a sudden got famous within the Southern Baptist Convention, and now she's just off the rails. And like you said, enough is enough with this kind of stuff. I mean, these people are allowed to say whatever they want to say with no reprimand. And it's not just her. I mean, there's, just look at Ed Litton. I mean, he's been to Southeastern Seminary and Southwestern Seminary in the past few weeks to go on there to preach at chapel, and then to lie to these students and say that he didn't plagiarize all these sermons, and then to say that all of the people making accusations against him are unnamed sources. I mean, and no pushback.
All of Ed's critics have been named. I don't think there's any question of their voluntary outing of themselves from the get-go.
Exactly.
But likewise, Danny Aiken's a smart man. And if Danny is as smart as I think he is, he's going to call Karen into his office and he's going to explain to her that she needs to make an apology. And if he doesn't, he's going to find out what vicarious liability means. It's that simple. And if anybody who watches you doesn't understand the problem with 1 Corinthians 6 here, you shouldn't sue each other. Well, I've had several Southern Baptist Convention presidents. So I'm a lawyer by training. I haven't practiced in years and years, but but that's my background. I assume the average SBC president is a theologian by background. I've had numerous of them tell me that in their view, Baptist church polity doesn't really permit for that to apply in cases where you aren't in the same church, because fact is, who am I going to go to? You know, if I have an issue with the pastor of fill in the blank Baptist church, who am I going to go to for redress? Him? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Do I have any way to call Karen Swallow Pryor before my elders? No, I do not. So if we were Presbyterians, we could extrapolate that passage beyond an individual local church. But in reality, if you have a wrongdoer, a clear wrongdoer who happens to be a member of a church, you are not thereby prohibited from having any redress for her bearing false witness against you. So we've got to get over that. Again,
Yeah,
I went to Baylor Law School, and we talked about this a little bit. I feel very confident about my scriptural basis here. And then I talked to, like I said, a bunch of theologians, and they said the same thing. So if anybody wants to take that up with me, they can talk to me after court.
I hear you. Rod, thank you so much for coming on here tonight, brother. Hopefully, I mean, you have so much information. I could, like I said, I could pick your brain all night. Hopefully we can do this again at some point, and
well, that'd be great.
Get into some of these other subjects.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm with that. I think I'm going to let you go. I got kids to feed. I'm sure you have family affairs to take care of. So
I have a thing or two to do too, but
Yeah.
it's been a joy and a privilege. I'm very grateful for you.
Thank you so much, Rod.
Thank you.
Have a good night, brother.
You too.